off of polls in New Hampshire, or a poll, let's say it that way. For New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders topped the number one position in that poll. CNN bent themselves into a pretzel in order to not say Bernie Sanders' name, or at the very least, supplant his position in that particular poll. Well, Sanders, Nevada, once again, pole position. It's amazing how a campaign that they said was absolutely dead has now taken the top spot in both of those polls. 29% Sanders, 27% Biden, 18% Warren, Kamala Harris, 6%, Pete Buttigieg, 4%. Kamala Harris is a hurt, broken woman at this point after that thrashing Tulsi Gabbard gave her. I want to go into this poll a little bit because this poll is fascinating and some of the things that it says. But I also want to talk about Iowa, because Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and if I'm not mistaken, South Carolina. Now, Biden is thinking we could lose 3 of those states and still keep going. I don't know. If the electability argument for Joe Biden falls apart or someone else is just as electable, I don't know if that argument works anymore. Let's take a look at some polling. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, this is not going to be a long video, but still, like, share, subscribe. I like polling. At the very least, I like trends in polling, meaning, yes, a particular poll, but also how that poll flows through time. Gives you this notion of momentum, whether a person is going up and down. Polls have a difference of perspectives of sorts, like Rasmussen tends to be more conservative. You may have other polls that trends a little bit more liberal. But the trend line, especially when you consider multiple polls, gives you a little bit more information. And especially when they're saying the same thing. Like Elizabeth Warren being the white candidate that seems to persist itself in multiple polls. Bernie Sanders being attractive to the youth that seems to persist itself. Joe Biden being attractive to the older demographic. And blacks. Older blacks. I've derided them as Negroes. I don't necessarily know if that's over the line or not. I guess I'll determine the line as my channel. But I say that to say, because this is going back into the 60s and so forth, terminology-wise, older African Americans, you have no idea how much that burns me, probably why I'm using the derisive term Negroes. Joe Biden gets on the stage and say they can't raise their kids. And they still are voting for him, or at the very least support him. Yes, it burns me. Let's look at this one. This is a CBS poll. Nevada. One Mr. Bernie Sanders. 29%. Joe Biden on his heels, 27%. Elizabeth Warren, far behind, 18%. Harris, 6%. And Buttigieg, that they put him in there for some reason at 4%. Going into the poll says really interesting things. So, first point. Nobody cares that Joe Biden is old or Bernie Sanders is old, meaning roughly 30%, but not any significant number. They especially don't care that Elizabeth Warren is also in her 70s for some reason. I guess by comparison, she seems younger. I mean, technically, she is younger. I'm just saying 70, 78. It's not a massive gap, or is it? Maybe the older you get, the more the massive the gap gets when you get those numbers. But fair enough. A third of the party was bothered by Sanders and Biden being too old for the job. But again, ultimately, it wasn't a big deal. Gender. Gender was one of the most interesting ones. When they asked the importance of gender in the candidates, 6% cared that Biden was a man, 3% cared that Sanders was a man. On the other side, Harris and Warren got almost 30% just because they're women. Look at this. Look at this. This is amazing. On the flip side, the same sample of voters said they would vote for Harris and Warren because they're women. Now, when I've said that of course you have people who have certain biases of the world that, especially working from an entirely identity way. Well, yes, look at it and say, these are the two eligible candidates. They're women. And especially if you can look at Sanders and Warren and say, I want something to the left. I also want a woman. She's close enough to him. I'll take her. I'll take her. Now, here's the other interesting point. 60% of the voters in this base was choosing either Sanders or Warren, meaning all of the conservative Democrats that were in the race for the most part made up 40%. Those two, and they made the point that said they like these two. They like these two. Warren has been aping Sanders' policies, and for the most part, whether she means it or not, at the very least, in the head of the voters who are looking at them and saying these two quantities are very similar, and she's a woman, so I'll go that route. For some, for about 30%. But in 60% knows this. I want this. This is what I want. That's awesome. That's awesome. They said Sanders' campaign was dead. He scored 2 polls in New Hampshire and the other one, not to mention all of these endorsements. AOC, Ilhan, Rashid Tlaib. There's another one in Iowa. But let's finish this one first. Now, they did make the point that Warren is getting more popular, especially from the standpoint of people thinking whether or not she could beat Trump. Beforehand, that number was lower. It's getting to the point of 50%. Now, who has the best chance? This goes back to the electability argument. 75% say Joe Biden. Sanders gets 66%. Now, this is basically just people based on your framing of the world and what you know of the outside world, that hazy exterior that is beyond you. By the same token, you're directly in it. What do you think the world is? And who do you think they'll vote for over somebody else? They choose Biden. But the problem for Biden is that Sanders' number is close. That number is close. Meaning, when people say, yes, I think Biden has the best chance, but Sanders is not that bad either. The problem for Biden is if those numbers get too close, then the electability argument falls away. And the other guy may be seen as electable and with vision for what he wants to do. That number should terrify Joe Biden. Another point. Healthcare, number one issue, 89%. Climate, 80%. Guns, 76%. Income inequality, 71%. Education, 50%. Those are the issues. Those are the issues that they care about. Think about this though. Education, meaning college. Income inequality. Climate. Healthcare. 4 of those issues are extremely progressive. And if I'm not mistaken, the gun thing is probably getting rid of, I don't know what they're going to do with guns, but doing something to stop mass shootings. And for the last part, vision. So the party, for the most part, if you notice, the polling is going in 2 separate tracks. Who do you think is more electable? Joe Biden, 76%. But Sanders is close. And then they say, what are the things you care about? And then for the most part, you get these lefty policies. Joe Biden is not running entirely based on policy. Joe Biden is running is because I'm electable. Well, I suspect that the reason that Sanders is edging him out in the polls at this point is because that same guess, that same balancing act of, well, Warren is a woman and she's close to Sanders, close enough. I suspect that is taking place here with Biden. Meaning, the closer those numbers get from the standpoint of Sanders, getting close to Biden from the standpoint of electability in the way that the public sees it, then the focus becomes less about who's more electable because they got that guy, but it also becomes policy. And when it becomes policy, the guy who has policy in spades is Bernie Sanders. Biden is losing out because his electability argument is starting to fall flat. It's starting to fall flat. Not to mention all of the other stuff that's going on. I mean, to be fair, there's also exterior stuff, right? I mean, the Hunter Biden stuff, the outright corruption that's been taking place over the course of Joe Biden's campaign being thrown out into the air as the Republican Party uses that stuff for fodder to try to take him down. They don't hit him from the left. And they should. If they were trying to take Biden out, they shouldn't hit him from the left. What do you care if that ad is hitting him from the left or from the right, if your objective is just to take down Joe Biden? But for whatever reason, they only really go in one particular direction, especially in the context of a primary. Creating an ad that hits Joe Biden from the standpoint of the left decapitates Joe Biden before he ever even gets into the election itself. The catch becomes who do Republicans want to run against, and in that comes the choice. If it was me, I would do it in a heartbeat. The objective isn't to get the person to vote for a Republican. That's not going to happen. The objective is to get them to not vote for Joe Biden. There's a difference. Yes, I would be cutthroat if I was in politics, which is why my mom said she never wanted me to be a lawyer. All right, so this is Stacey Walker. Apparently, I don't know this gentleman, but he was a big endorsement in Iowa. Now, this goes along with the other endorsements that Sanders got from AOC, essentially a juggernaut. Ilhan Omar, again, somewhat of a rock star from the standpoint of the attacks that Republicans have been leveraging against them and attacks by their own party. And Rashid Tlaib, big endorsements. He's keeping that up. Stacey Walker was called the Des Moines Register one of the most sought-after endorsements in Iowa this election cycle. Today, Walker threw his support behind Sanders for President of the United States. He's not the first local leader to back the candidate in the race. Several lawmakers and city leaders in eastern Iowa have announced their support for various candidates, but Walker appears to be getting the most attention on the national stage.
After, honestly, all these candidates for all these months.
Yeah, so there are a lot of capable and qualified candidates in this race, but Senator Bernie Sanders is by far and away the most progressive, and I think he's best positioned to defeat Donald Trump in the general election. And ultimately, that's what we need.
Obviously, one of the big questions has been about his age. He's the oldest candidate in this race, and there's a number of people who are carrying many of the messages he is that are significantly younger. So I guess to many, he's kind of the original.
I always hate it when people say that, because that tells me you know nothing about what's taking place. Just because somebody is toting a message that is similar, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the same, nor will have the same effects, nor that the individual that is toting it is sincere in their toting it. Meaning, just because somebody sounds the same, is somewhat of a copy, as Nina Turner say, or an echo, as I like to say, doesn't necessarily mean that echo has the same strength and vigor of the person who actually means it. If I am looking at this political space and I'm trying to figure out what do I want to look like, or what do I want the world to look like, and I have various horses in the race that I can essentially choose, just because somebody parrots a note doesn't mean they mean it. And pretending as such, I think, is the weirdest thing in the world. It's the weirdest thing in the world. How much of the platforms have the politicians over the past several election cycles put through? Now, Obama did push through Obamacare, but the public option was essentially ripped away. And for the most part, he gave that to Congress and let Congress put through a right-wing healthcare plan on a president who was screaming about hope and change. I guess my point is, just because they say it, don't necessarily mean they mean it. And yes, if you're going to vote for somebody, vote for the guy that means it. And by the way, if your issue is with his age, he can have a vice president, and he will be the one who chooses that vice president with the notion of that vice president carrying on his particular legacy and his particular vision if anything went wrong. This age thing is nonsense. This age thing is nonsense. Let's let him keep going.
Messenger of some of these causes like Medicare for All, do you think that still makes him the best?
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned there are a lot of other candidates in the race that are talking about variations on a theme of what he's already proposed. And, I think he's the best positioned because he's the one who's offering these plans that they're talking about. But also, he goes the furthest. He's by far and away the most progressive candidate in this race, and he's been talking about these issues for decades. And so I'd like to reward that. And when you add on top of the fact that he's brought together one of the most diverse coalition of supporters, I think.
God, I love that. I love that. God, I love that. Did you hear what he said? He said he's been talking about this for decades, and Sanders has. Sanders was out in the cold, like out in the wilderness, and he still had that particular disposition politically, in politics, meaning he was out there, not necessarily one of the in the in club, and he kept that political disposition nonetheless. Even when it was not necessarily the most feasible to do so, he kept his political disposition. He kept his shape. His point is, I want to reward that behavior. Meaning the fact that he was willing to go through all of that, keep that disposition, stay that same way in that hostile territory, or at times when it wasn't necessarily the most feasible. I want to give him credit for that. I want to give him props for that. Do you remember when I mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, and I said Tulsi Gabbard stepped down from the DNC despite all of the political pressure essentially torching her career, all of these people attacking her and everything else? I strongly believe to some degree, yes, foreign policy, but also that. She gets credit for me for that. When people say, why do you support her in the way you support her, meaning covering her in the sense of news and everything else, she's earned it. She supported my guy. She supported my guy when they were cheating my guy. Friends are few, and in this particular situation, she showed herself to be loyal, or at the very least principled, in the person she was willing to support. Elizabeth Warren didn't do that. Gabbard did. I like his point. That's all. He's earned it. Sanders opened up the political space that all of these people are dancing in. And that echo that didn't have the courage to get into the race in 2016 and didn't have the courage to support the guy who she was supposedly closest ideologically to, instead throwing her support behind Clinton. Now that echo wants to get the nod for something she didn't create. Yeah, the answer is no.
I think any presidential campaign has ever seen. What that means is we actually have a shot at achieving this ambitious policy program because we're going to have folks mobilized to put pressure on members of Congress to make sure we can pass this legislation.
I have to ask, because Iowa gets so much attention for more than a year, and people really are able to get up close and personal with these candidates, how impactful are endorsements like yours and Councilman Todd, who endorsed Cory Booker, Senator Mathis, who endorsed Amy Klobuchar? How impactful do you think really sticking your neck out for a candidate is?
Well, it's time to stand up and be counted. And I think each of the folks that you mentioned have their own constituency group, and folks listen to them. I mean, that's the whole point of a endorsement. It's to find validators, to communicate with people who trust you, who you communicate with regularly, to say this is the candidate that I think is going to be best for America. And for me, a lot of working class folks live in my district. A lot of minorities live in my district. And I represent the second most populous county in the state of Iowa. So, a lot of folks are going to be listening to this message, and I hope to get out on the campaign trail and spread the good news about Bernie Sanders to many others across the state.
Whether Senator Sanders gets the nomination this time or somebody else does, obviously many people look at 2016 and are concerned about where the Democratic Party goes once a nominee is selected. Are you convinced that this party will coalesce around a candidate in the general election this time around?
Yeah, absolutely. We have no choice. Donald Trump is a clear and present danger to our democracy, and he has not been helpful to this country or the world. So I think Democrats understand that. A really cool thing about this election cycle, however, is the top two highest performing candidates are both progressives. So I don't think it's going to be problematic, whoever gets the nomination, for Democrats to rally around. I'm just excited because that candidate's going to be Bernie Sanders.
I'm sorry, the top two candidates are not progressives. Yes, they parrot. She shakes. She gesticulates. But it's one thing to parrot. It's another thing to actually believe. And I got to be honest, I don't have any strong belief on this stuff. Yes, she's probably strong on Wall Street. Like I said, she'd punch a banker in her throat if she can get away with it. But beyond that, I mean, foreign policy, no. Israel-Palestine, no. And you have to believe the person. That is infinitely true. Obama screaming hope and change. What did you think was going to take place when he got in office? What did you get? One last point. The polling for Sanders in Iowa hasn't been entirely strong. In fact, he's fallen to the fourth place behind Buttigieg, at least in the real clear politics average. But his campaign put out this. Listen to this. Sanders' campaign managers recognized the need for additional voters, telling Wall Street Journal this week that for Sanders' victory, he needs a mass mobilization of people who have not voted before. In a note to Sanders supporters on Friday, the campaign's Iowa State Director, Misty Reblick, said they already collected more commitments to caucus for Bernie Sanders than we had on January 1st, 2016. And there are, how many people in this race? Like 12? And he has more. And with Clinton, it was only 2 of them. Now, the catch here is Sanders, if I am not mistaken, he came like within a point, like almost less than a point of Clinton in that last election. They're putting this out to get across that, look, we know what the polling says, but we have boots on the ground. And whatever the polling says, we have an army on the ground that is going to push for us. Do not be disheartened. That's what I take from it. What do you take from it? That said, Stacey Walker endorses Sanders. CBS poll showing Sanders in the pole position in Nevada. And we just had a poll recently showing Sanders in the pole position in New Hampshire. For a guy that's supposed to be on his deathbed, in the campaign, he seems to be doing pretty damn well. All right, I'm going to end this because this one has gone 22 minutes. Like, share, subscribe.